Welcome to the We Get Privacy podcast. I'm Joe Lazzarotti, and I'm joined with my co-host, Damon Silver. Damon and I co-lead the Privacy, AI, and Cybersecurity group here at Jackson Lewis. And in that role, we receive a variety of questions every day from our clients, all of which boil down to the core question of how do we handle our data security? In other words, how do we leverage all of the great things data can do for our organization without running headfirst into a wall of legal risk? And how could we manage that risk without unnecessarily hindering our business operations?
On each episode of the podcast, Joe and I talk through a common question that we're getting from our clients. And we talk it through in the same way that we would with our clients, meaning with a focus on the practical. What are the legal risks? What options are available to manage those risks? And what should we be mindful of from an execution perspective? Our multi-part question for today is, why is data mining necessary? Why does it cost so much? And how can we do it more efficiently? To tackle these questions, we've invited on a special guest, Matt Morocco. Matt's a cyber practice lead at Consilio and has regularly partnered with our team on a variety of data mining projects. So Matt, before we jump into data mining, would you mind just telling our audience a little bit about yourself and your role at Consilio?
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Damon, for having me on. Matt Morocco. I'm based in Pittsburgh, where I've spent most of my life and most of my career. I'm a director at Consilio, a global e-discovery and litigation services and consulting company. And over the past 5 years or so, having founded, along with a partner of mine, our insurance practice, focusing on our insurance carrier clients and their business needs, cyber has obviously become a very large part and a specialized part of the e-discovery business. So we'll be talking about data mining, which and document review, which are core practices in e-discovery, and how we specialize tools and processes and workflows, towards navigating the specialization that happens in a cyber incident response.
Great. Thanks, Matt. So, Joe, maybe to tee things up for the discussion here, there's probably some members of the audience who are very familiar with data mining, others who have never even heard the word. So just at a very high level, Joe, what is data mining and why might it be necessary?
Well, for our purposes in the cybersecurity world, doing incident response, it basically amounts to trying to really get a handle on what data, if any, that constitutes a certain type of data we're looking for or concerned about was compromised by an unauthorized third party who is in the company's systems. So if you have a ransomware attack, or if you have a business email compromise and forensic firm says, yeah, it looks like this data was exfiltrated from your systems, or here's the file list that the threat actor who deployed ransomware in your environment says that they took. The question then becomes, one, did they really take that? And two, if we feel like there's a reasonable likelihood that they did, how do we dig into that data? Because oftentimes, as I'm sure Matt can tell us, and I know from our own experience we've seen, could be substantial amounts of data that to be able to go through that by person to person doing a manual review without the help of folks like Consilio, that can be a very arduous process.
Yeah, and Joe, just to piggyback on something you just said there are definitely incidents we handle where we have a pretty clear sense of what the total universe of data that might need to be mined is, because you gave the example of an attack where the bad actor actually takes data, exfiltrates data from the environment. They provide a tree with the names of all the files that they took. So there's this defined set of data, which we'll talk about this in a moment, doesn't necessarily mean all of it needs to be mined, but that's sort of the starting point. There are other types of incidents, though, where through the forensic investigation, we might see that a bad actor had access to email accounts or had access to certain systems, but we don't have a specific set of documents or specific set of files that we know for sure they took or know for sure they accessed. So, and Joe, maybe this is something we can talk about a little bit more just before we even get to the point of working with Matt's team and bringing them in to help with the data mining. what are some of the things that we try and work through with clients so that we're properly defining the scope of the potential data mining project in the way that's going to put us in the position to tackle the project as efficiently as we can?
Well, I think one thing is just understanding the client and the client's business, and maybe tapping into the institutional knowledge that they have and saying, look, this is what is potentially at risk. So in the case, just to use a business email compromise, for example, what's the role of the person who owns that account? Are they someone who is dealing with X, Y, or Z? And if you are in a particular type of business and that person fits a certain role, you might have a good sense of the kind of data that they will likely have in email exchanges while they're doing their job. So if it's somebody who is, in take a CPA firm, for example, and that email was, belonged to a tax preparer, there's a good chance that that person might have tax return information of some kind, either in their inbox, their sent items, their deleted items. And so you kind of say, well, then we probably need to really look at that. Whereas if you're talking to someone who's just, putting together content for promotional activities, you might say, well, the likelihood of personal data is not likely there. And then that may shape things like, well, what things do we search for? And how do we how much effort do we put into that search? But that's just one way to look at that, Damon, in terms of approaching the next step of bringing someone like Matt in.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And just to throw one more out there, we recently were working with a university that had a ransomware attack, and the initial data set was 10 terabytes, which is a very significant volume of data that appeared to have been impacted. And it wasn't a situation where we were clear on what was exfiltrated. It was just based on where the ransomware was deployed and based on what we were able to see through forensics, which was not a whole lot. Those were the files that were potentially in scope. And the initial inclination on the client's part was just to data mine the whole 10 terabytes because they didn't want to, understandably, have to really dig into this data set and try and figure stuff out themselves. But then they saw the statement of work for data mining 10 terabytes, and it was a lot. And so, at that point, we started working with them, in coordination with their cyber carrier, and we were able to actually get that 10 terabytes of data down to about 50 gigabytes of data, which is dramatically less. It was a much more reasonable scope of work, and it did take probably a month of very intensive back and forth with the client's team, with our team, but it had a dramatic impact on the overall cost of the project and frankly on how long the project took. And these projects tend to take a long time no matter what, but if you're doing 10 terabytes of data mining, it's going to take a hell of a lot longer than if you're able to make that a more manageable amount of data at the front end. So Matt, let's assume that Joe and I have done everything we can from the standpoint of working directly with the client to identify data that does need to be data mined. So we reach out to you, as we have many times before, to say, we have this project. Can you take the audience through, a sort of insider's look at what happens next? What does the process look like on your end?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you already touched on, a key aspect of the scoping process that we look at before we get involved in these matters is, what is the client industry and what is the data source? Who were the data owners that were involved? And, that gives us a sense going in to help set and manage expectations. And really, it's a big part of my role and, a key part of the collaboration between, a Consilio and counsel and the cyber carrier to, set and manage the proper expectations. We want to be sensitive always to what these clients are going through, having had this experience, and how are we going to make the most efficient and really cost-effective process. And, that comes down a lot of times to, leveraging as much technology as we can. We move data through a funnel is really the best, sort of visual that we can provide. And whether it's 10 terabytes, 1 terabyte, or 100 gigabytes, keeping in perspective that to some companies, even 100 gigabytes is a massive amount of data, for them to think about sort of wading through. And for a company like us, to get through that amount of data and really get down to what's sensitive. And that can be different things in different matters. It could be sensitive contractual information. It could be IP, or it could be, what we'll call your more garden variety, PII or PHI that's at issue. The goal being to reduce the amount of data down to the least amount of documents that need to be looked at, whether by manual review or what we call programmatic extraction. Programmatic extraction is really where we have spreadsheets or what we refer to as structured data that can be automated in terms of how we get that information out and then provide it to you for analysis to determine whether there's a notification obligation. And so anywhere that we can avoid manual tedious processes and data entry and allowing more room for error or requiring more quality control, we're going to leverage technology to get through those processes. So we start out with data mining, which is the fancier term for e-discovery, which means we're going to create an index of the data. We're going to throw some analytics tools at it, and we're going to try to identify sensitive information. And that, again, can be things like date of birth or social security number, credit card numbers. There are ways to search for number strings to identify sensitive information, taking into account whether we're dealing with just U.S. data or we have maybe GDPR or other regional jurisdictional non-English languages to take into account. And we're going to put that data through sort of an iterative rinse and repeat process where we run some searches, we provide some results back, and really want, wherever we can, to get the clients involved. Ideally, they know their data and they can identify, someone in the company who can help us, quickly get at, whether there's folders or directory trees, within the data that, they know maybe have test data. We encounter a lot in insurance companies or health systems where they have anonymized or test data that appears as though it's sensitive, but it's really, something that can be put aside. You might have, contracts. You might have information where if a client can assist in that process by saying, we believe the majority of sensitive data is going to lie within these folders, and we believe there's not going to be any in these folders. We can look at, prioritizing and triaging those data sets to get to information faster, to reduce the amount of manual review. Maybe it just takes some statistical sampling for us to validate, where the sensitive information is and how we're going to prioritize that review. The thing to remember is that there's always a ticking clock, right? Once there's a process that started and there's, maybe a regulatory requirement to satisfy, we all want to collaborate as much as we can on not wasting time reviewing documents that are unlikely to contain sensitive information, and how quickly and accurately we can get information to you and your team to start the analysis, really to consult with that client about what their obligations might be.
So, Matt, one thing that's, I think, developed over the last few years is we often think about breaches as involving personal data, social security number, credit card number. And then a little bit more with HIPAA, it gets a little bit more complicated, I think, in terms of trying to find whether a document has health information about an individual. And as we've seen more recently, right, there's, critical infrastructure, there's federal contractors, there's a whole range, SEC requirements. How are you seeing the evolution of breach notification, in quotes, right, change because of the increased regulatory environment that is getting at disclosures of information that may not fall into the typical social security number or strings of numbers. How do you try to deal with that issue in these projects?
That's a great question, Joe. Thanks. It really comes down to that sort of consultative, upfront approach, right? Where working with your team, we want to set the right process in place. PII and PHI can be commonplace these days, but it doesn't always mean that the puzzle pieces fit together easily, right? You got to kind of sometimes dig around where you have pieces of people's information in one place on one document and other pieces scattered throughout a data set. And so some of the challenges, that we face are finding those pieces of information and putting them together and making sure that we're not combining, two John Smiths where they don't belong. And then, validating that information so that, you have an accurate notification process. When it gets to some of the more complex challenges in terms of data sets that don't present just on personal or health information, and we have sensitive information that might be contractual, it might be, intellectual property, it might be, as you mentioned, a government contract or, type information. It requires more specialized review, really. You don't necessarily always have the same folks doing, manual data entry review for Social Security numbers as you might want, analyzing a contract to determine, what someone's notification obligations are and how sensitive that information might be. So, there are certainly occasions where we're bifurcating those review workflows and making sure that the right folks are staffed on them. And then, leveraging other types of technology that get more into sort of an e-discovery space where we might be using analytics to further investigate a data set and help us identify sensitive information beyond just, face value, so to speak, of credit card numbers and dates of birth.
Yeah, Matt, I mean, I think a really important point you've made, both when talking about the front end and then talking about sort of the iterative process as you go through the data set, is that it really does pay to make an investment in being clear about what your objectives are, what you're looking for, what your risk tolerance is. Do you want to find every single last document, or is there some amount of buffer that the client is comfortable with given the other circumstances? Because I think there is a tendency with this, as with other things, when there's time pressure and there's resource pressure, to say let's just use your standard set of terms for PII and let's just move this forward as quickly as we can. But it may not be the case that a cookie cutter set of terms is really what's going to best serve the client if, to your point, they're dealing with data that might be subject to a contract, it might be confidential information, or to Joe's point, that might be PHI under HIPAA, or that might have might be subject to other laws that have a more nuanced definition. And then as you're going through the process, and we've done this many times with your team, maybe they're coming across documents that suggest a pattern of false hits. Something that seems to be fitting in one of our PII categories, but consistently isn't. And are there then subsequent programmatic searches that we can run to try and identify those other false hits? And in some instances, we've been able to eliminate or significantly reduce the population of documents that actually need to be manually reviewed by the team because we are able to identify these patterns. So, I mean, could you speak a little bit to that last point around once you have your initial set of documents that your team is manually reviewing, what they're looking for and what you do if you see opportunities maybe to streamline that review further?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite lines I learned my first job as a reinsurance paralegal many moons ago was, "You get what you inspect," right? And so it's important to have a QC process and a validation process. And as you mentioned, to sort of not necessarily just always take the standard set of search terms and throw things straight over to review just because maybe, it sounds like it's super cheap to do it on a per document basis, or, you feel like you're under a time pressure. The more data that you're possibly putting through that process means, the more data that might come out of it, or, you might think that there's an increased potential for notifications. Whereas, spending a little bit of extra time up front for what we, sort of generically call advanced data mining, can have a very large impact on the amount of work that needs to go into the process, the amount of time it takes, and the overall cost. And advanced data mining can take many flavors. One of the most common being pattern recognition, as you mentioned. We have ways to identify what we call unique hits, which are documents that might hit on a single term out of all of the terms that we run. And that's usually an indicator that that's an outlier. One of my favorite examples is the word passport, and knowing that there happens to be a software out there called Passport. And so, you want to take time to collaborate, understand the client's business again, where some of these terms of art can often be confused and throw false positives at the process. And if you can spend a little time to try to identify patterns, work with the client and be consultative in terms of what kind of results you're seeing and whether it makes sense that they would have information or have data that contains this type of information, you can often have a really significant impact on the overall timeline and the overall cost.
Yeah, Matt, thank you. I think that is a great place actually for us to start winding things down. Thanks to everyone for joining us as always. We have a designated email address, privacy@jacksonlewis.com, where we're always happy to receive your feedback on this episode, any questions for Matt or for me or Joe. And if you have ideas for other topics that you'd like to see us cover in the future on the podcast, please share those as well. So Matt, thanks again so much for taking the time to join us. I think this has been extremely helpful for Joe and me, and hopefully for our audience as well. And, we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks. Really appreciate the time. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Jackson Lewis's podcast, We Get Privacy for Work. As a reminder, this material is provided for informational purposes only. It is not intended to constitute legal advice, nor does it create a client-lawyer relationship between Jackson Lewis and any recipient. We Get Privacy for Work is available on Apple Podcasts, Libsyn, and YouTube. For more information on our topics, presenters, and other Jackson Lewis resources, visit jacksonlewis.com.